The crystal chandeliers of the Meridian estate cast dancing shadows across 200 faces, all turned toward me like I was some kind of circus act. My son, Malcolm, stood frozen at the altar in his $1,000 tuxedo, his jaw slack, as two security guards flanked me, one on each arm, their grip firm, but not quite gentle enough for a 62-year-old woman in heels. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," the taller guard murmured, his voice lost in the collective gasp that rippled through the wedding guests. I tried to plant my feet, but the Persian runner beneath me might as well have been ice. My knees, already aching from the morning's stress, buckled slightly as they guided me down the aisle, the same aisle I'd watched my only child walk just moments before. "Malcolm!" I called out, my voice cracking like old parchment. "Malcolm, please!" But he wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were fixed on her, Soraya Venin, soon to be Soraya Calder, standing radiant in her ivory silk gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, not a strand out of place, despite the commotion I'd apparently caused by simply trying to attend my own son's wedding. The whispers followed me like smoke. "Isn't that his mother? What did she do? My God, how embarrassing." Mrs. Pemberton from the country club covered her mouth with her gloved hand, her eyes wide with the kind of horrified fascination people reserve for car accidents. Judge Harrison, who'd known Malcolm since he was 12, shook his silver head and looked away. Even Father Mackenzie, who was supposed to be officiating this blessed union, stood with his mouth slightly open, his prayer book dangling forgotten in his hands. My purse slipped from my shoulder, the contents scattering across the marble floor. Reading glasses, breath mints, the crumpled tissue I'd brought for happy tears. A young groomsman, one of Malcolm's fraternity brothers, stepped around my scattered belongings like they were contaminated. "This is a private ceremony," the shorter guard said, his tone suggesting this wasn't his first wedding disruption. "You weren't on the guest list." Wasn't on the guest list. The words hit me like cold water. I'd raised Malcolm alone for 17 years after his father died. I'd worked double shifts at the construction company to keep food on our table and clothes on his back. I sat in hospital waiting rooms during his appendectomy, held his head during food poisoning, and drove through snowstorms to pick him up from college parties. And I wasn't on the guest list for his wedding. The massive oak doors of the estate grew larger with each step, but just before we reached them, I heard the sound that would haunt me for weeks. Soraya's voice, crystal clear and deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you for handling that so discreetly." I twisted in the guard's grip, my shoulders screaming in protest, and saw her facing the crowd with a serene smile. She wasn't even looking at me. I was already erased, already nothing. But then she did look. Those pale green eyes met mine across the lengthened reception hall, and her perfectly glossed lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. She leaned toward Malcolm, who bent his head to listen, his face a mask I didn't recognize. When she straightened, she walked toward me with the confident stride of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. The guards paused, uncertain whether to continue removing me or wait for the bride's approach. Soraya stopped just close enough that her words would be for me alone, but far enough away that the cameras, yes, there were cameras because even my humiliation was being documented, wouldn't catch the venom in her whisper. "Stay gone," she said,
her voice soft as silk and sharp as broken glass. "This is our world now." The guards resumed their escort, and the doors closed behind me with a sound like thunder. I stood on the limestone steps, my chest tight and my vision blurry, watching through tall windows as the ceremony continued without me. Malcolm kissed his bride. The crowd applauded. Champagne flutes cut the light like tiny stars. I fumbled in my coat pocket for my car keys, my arthritic fingers shaking so badly I dropped them on the stone steps twice. A valet, probably younger than my grandson would have been, picked them up and handed them to me with the look of such profound pity that I wanted to disappear entirely. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and stop signs that I barely registered. My little house on Maple Street, the same house where Malcolm learned to walk, lost his first tooth, and brought home his first report card, felt smaller and shabbier than ever after the opulence of the Meridian estate. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, watching Mrs. Chen next door water her roses in the fading light. She waved, probably wondering why I was back so early from what should have been the happiest day of my life. Inside, the silence was deafening. The wedding gift I'd wrapped so carefully that morning, a set of crystal glasses from Eldrick and I's wedding registry, saved for 30 years, sat on my kitchen table like an accusation. I'd planned to slip it to Malcolm during the reception, maybe share a quiet moment before the dancing began. Instead, I poured myself 3 fingers of the whiskey Eldrick used to drink on the anniversary of his father's death and tried to make sense of what had just happened. I thought that was the end of my relationship with my son, the final severing of a bond I'd spent my entire adult life nurturing. But I was wrong. It was only the beginning. The whiskey burned, but not as much as the memory of Malcolm's face. Blank, distant, like I was a stranger who'd wandered into his wedding by mistake. I set the glass down and stared at the framed photo on my mantel. Malcolm at 8, gap-toothed and grinning, clutching the trophy from his Little League championship. I'd been there for every game, cheering from the bleachers even when my back ached from 12-hour days at Calder Construction. Calder Construction. The business Eldrick built from nothing. The one I'd somehow kept alive after his heart attack took him at 47. Malcolm was only 10 then, too young to understand why Mommy suddenly spent her evenings hunched over ledgers instead of helping with homework. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through 3 years of increasingly distant conversations with my son. The change hadn't happened overnight. That would have been easier to fight. Instead, it was a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. The first time I'd met Soraya was at Malcolm's graduation from business school. She glided across the campus quad in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her hand possessively wrapped around Malcolm's arm. Everything about her was perfectly curated. The subtle highlights in her chestnut hair, the understated diamond earrings, the way she spoke in measured, cultured tones that made my working-class accent feel suddenly harsh. "Mrs. Calder," she'd said, extending a manicured hand, "Malcolm has told me so much about you." But her pale green eyes had been calculating, cataloging, taking inventory of my off-the-rack dress, my practical shoes, the calluses on my palms from years of handling contracts and difficult contractors. I'd felt evaluated and found wanting, though I couldn't pinpoint why. "It's wonderful to finally meet you," I had replied, meaning it. Any woman who could make my son smile the way he was smiling had to have something special. Oh, how naive I'd been. Over the following months, Malcolm's calls became shorter, more perfunctory. When I'd suggest dinner, he'd claim work was too busy. When I'd drop by his apartment unannounced, something I'd done his whole life, he'd seem uncomfortable, rushing me out after 20 minutes with excuses about plans with Soraya. "She thinks it's important for couples to establish boundaries," He'd explained one evening when I'd questioned why I hadn't been invited to his birthday celebration, especially with parents. It's healthier. Healthier. As if loving my son was some kind of disease. The worst part was how reasonable it all sounded. Soraya never said anything directly confrontational. She'd smile sweetly and make gentle suggestions about how enmeshed some families could be, how important it was for young men to individuate from their mothers. She sprinkled psychological terms into casual conversation like seasoning, making her manipulation sound like wisdom. I should have trusted my instincts. Every contractor's wife learns to read people. You have to when you're dealing with subcontractors who will smile to your face and walk off the job site the next day. But with Soraya, I'd second-guessed myself. She was educated, sophisticated, everything I thought Malcolm deserved. Who was I to stand in the way of his happiness? The breaking point came 6 months ago during what should have been a celebration. Calder Construction had just landed the biggest contract in the company's history, a mixed-use development that would keep us busy for 2 years. I'd called Malcolm, breathless with excitement, wanting to share the news with the son I'd groomed to eventually take over the business.
"Mom, that's great," he'd said, his voice flat. "Listen, Soraya and I have been talking. We think it might be time for you to consider selling the company." The words hit me like a physical blow. Selling? Malcolm, this is our legacy. Your father's legacy. Dad's been gone for 15 years, he'd replied. And there was something in his tone I'd never heard before. Impatience, dismissal. Soraya's father has connections in real estate development. He could help you get top dollar, and then you wouldn't have to worry about the stress anymore. Julius Vennet. I knew the name, knew the reputation. A developer who'd made his fortune buying up struggling properties and turning them into luxury condos, displacing families who'd lived in their neighborhoods for generations. The kind of man my Eldrick had despised. "I don't want to sell," I said quietly. "And I thought maybe you'd want to join me, learn the business. We could work together." The pause stretched so long, I'd wondered if the call had dropped. When Malcolm finally spoke, his words were like ice water. "Mom, I think you need to accept that I'm not going to be the son you imagined. Soraya and I are building our own life, and we need you to respect that." Soraya and I. When had he stopped saying I and started saying we? After that conversation, the invitation stopped coming altogether. No more Sunday dinners, no more holiday planning calls, no more casual check-ins about work or weather, or the mundane details that comprise a mother's knowledge of her child's life. When I'd finally worked up the courage to ask about wedding plans, surely I'd be involved in planning my only son's wedding, Malcolm had been vague, deflective. "We're keeping it small, just close family and friends." Just close family. Apparently, that didn't include me. Now, sitting in my kitchen with my wedding gift still wrapped and waiting, I pulled out the filing cabinet where I kept all of Eldrick's old paperwork, insurance policies, tax returns, business documents, everything I'd been too grief-stricken to examine closely in the months after his death. There, in a manila envelope marked estate planning, was a stack of papers I'd signed without reading. Eldrick had been so sick those final weeks, and the lawyers had made everything sound routine, just protecting the business, ensuring smooth transitions, providing for Malcolm's future. I'd signed where they pointed, trusting my dying husband's judgment, focused only on spending what time we had left together. But as I spread the documents across my kitchen table, squinting at the legal language in the lamplight, one name kept appearing in places that didn't make sense.
Vennet. Julius Vennet. Witness. Julius Vennet, consulting attorney. Julius Vennet recommended by Eldrick's primary counsel. My hand started shaking again, but this time it wasn't from age or stress. It was recognition. The cold, creeping awareness that I'd been played, that the game had been rigged long before I'd even known I was playing. The papers in front of me weren't just estate planning documents. They were something else entirely. Something that explained why Soraya had looked so confident when she'd told me to stay gone, why Malcolm had been so certain I'd accept my banishment without a fight. But the truth behind those papers was darker than I realized.
I didn't sleep that night. By 6 a.m., I was parked outside Malcolm's apartment building, the same converted warehouse in the arts district where I'd helped him move in 4 years ago. Back then, he'd been proud to show me the exposed brick walls, the industrial fixtures he'd installed himself, using skills I taught him during summer jobs at the construction site. Now I felt like a stalker, waiting in my car with a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope full of questions that needed answers. Malcolm emerged at 7:30, dressed in one of those expensive suits Soraya had convinced him he needed for networking. His hair was perfectly styled, his stride confident. Everything about him screamed success, prosperity, arrival. He looked like Julius Vennet's protege more than Eldrick Calder's son. "Malcolm," I called out, stepping from my car. My left hip protested after hours of sitting, and I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. He froze, his hand halfway to his BMW's door handle. For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or surprise. Then it was gone, replaced by the same cold mask he'd worn at the wedding. "Mom, you can't be here." "I need to talk to you." My voice sounded smaller than I'd intended, pleading in a way that made me hate myself. 5 minutes, please." He glanced around the parking lot, checking for witnesses, and I realized he was embarrassed to be seen with me. His own mother, the woman who sung him lullabies and nursed him through chickenpox and worked herself to exhaustion to give him every opportunity. 5 minutes, he said finally. But he didn't invite me up to his apartment. We stood beside my 15-year-old Honda like conspirators planning something shameful. "The papers," I began, pulling out the manila envelope. "The ones your father had me sign before he died. There are things in here that don't make sense, Malcolm. Your wife's father's name appears on documents I never—" "Stop." The word came out sharp, violent. "Just stop, Mom." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my son's face. "Stop what? Asking questions about my own husband's estate? Stop acting like you're entitled to know everything. Stop acting like the world revolves around you." His voice was rising, and a jogger passing by slowed down to stare. Malcolm noticed and lowered his tone, but the venom remained. "Soraya was right about you from the beginning." The words hit me like a slap. "Right about what?" "That you're poison?" He said it calmly, matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. "That you use guilt and manipulation to control people? That you've spent your entire life making me responsible for your happiness?" I actually stepped backward, my hand flying to my chest. The envelope scattered to the ground, papers dancing in the morning breeze like autumn leaves. "Malcolm, how can you say that? I've never—" "Never what? Never called me crying when I missed a Sunday dinner? Never shown up unannounced to check on me whenever I started dating someone?
Never made passive-aggressive comments about how lonely you are, how much you sacrifice for me? Each accusation felt like a knife twist because there was just enough truth in them to make me doubt myself, to wonder if love could look like selfishness from the outside. "I raised you alone," I whispered. "Everything I did was for you." "No," he said, and his voice was gentle now, which somehow hurt worse than the anger. "Everything you did was for you, to make yourself feel needed, to make yourself feel important. Soraya helped me see that."
I bent to gather the scattered papers, my arthritic knees screaming in protest. "Your father would be ashamed of you. My father is dead, and maybe it's time you accepted that and built your own life instead of living through mine." He got in his car and drove away, leaving me kneeling on the asphalt in my church dress, collecting documents I was beginning to suspect might not even matter. But I couldn't give up. Not yet. 3 hours later, I sat in the waiting room of Drury, Hastings and Associates, the law firm that had handled Eldrick's affairs for 20 years. Clement Drury had been at our wedding, had drafted our first business contracts, had held my hand at Eldrick's funeral, and promised that everything would be taken care of. The waiting room had been redecorated since my last visit. Gone were the homey touches, the family photos on Clement's desk, the comfortable leather chairs where we planned Eldrick's will while he was still healthy enough to care about such things. Now everything was sleek, modern, expensive, like Soraya. "Mrs. Calder." Clement appeared in his office doorway, and I barely recognized him. The friendly, rumpled lawyer I remembered had been replaced by a man in an Armani suit, his silver hair professionally styled, his manner polished and distant. "Clement, thank God. I need your help understanding these documents." "I'm afraid that won't be possible." He didn't invite me into his office, didn't offer coffee or condolences or even a seat. "I no longer represent your interests, Ruth. There would be a conflict." The use of my first name, casual, dismissive, told me everything I needed to know. A conflict with what? I now represent Malcolm, and given the complexities of your family situation, I think it's best if you seek independent counsel. Complexities? Clement, you've known me for 20 years. You know I would never. I know that family dynamics can be complicated, and sometimes the kindest thing we can do for people we care about is help them find appropriate boundaries. Boundaries. Soraya's favorite word. As I turned to leave, my peripheral vision caught something that made my blood freeze. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I saw 2 men shaking hands over a stack of documents. One was Malcolm, still in his expensive suit. The other was older, silver-haired, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never hearing the word no. Julius Vennet, Soraya's father. I ducked behind a potted plant, ridiculous behavior for a grown woman, but I needed to see what happened next. Julius handed Malcolm a thick manila envelope, identical to the one I had found in Eldrick's files. They spoke in low voices, their body language conspiratorial, intimate in the way of men sharing secrets. When they finished, Julius clapped Malcolm on the shoulder like a proud father. The gesture was possessive, claiming, and Malcolm smiled in response, the same smile he used to give me when I praise his report cards or attend his school plays.
I waited until they left separately, then approached the receptionist with shaking hands. "Excuse me, what was that meeting about? The one with Mr. Vennett and my son?" The young woman looked confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't discuss client business. Perhaps if you call to schedule an appointment." "I'm Malcolm Calder's mother."
Her expression shifted to something like pity. "Ma'am, I really can't help you. Mr. Drury was very clear about the situation." The situation. As if my desire to understand my own husband's estate was some kind of mental health crisis. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. The envelope Julius had given Malcolm, the way Clement had looked at me, not like an old friend, but like a problem to be managed. The casual cruelty in Malcolm's voice when he'd called me poison. This wasn't just about a wedding invitation or hurt feelings or even Soraya's manipulation. This was bigger, more organized, more deliberate than I had imagined. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a long moment, staring at my modest house with its peeling paint and overgrown garden. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed. It all felt suddenly fragile, like it could disappear with the signing of a paper I never saw on. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll lose more than just your son." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Someone was watching me. Someone knew about my visit to Clement's office, my conversation with Malcolm, maybe even my late-night examination of Eldrick's papers. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my daughter-in-law didn't like me? That my son was angry? That his lawyer had switched sides? It all sounded so petty, so domestic, so easily explained away by a woman who couldn't accept that her child had grown up. But as I sat there in my driveway, clutching that threatening text, I realized this was just another manipulation tactic. They wanted me to feel paranoid, isolated, crazy. They wanted me to doubt my own perceptions, to question whether I was imagining the conspiracy that was unfolding around me. Well, I'd spent 30 years in construction. I knew the difference between a solid foundation and one built on sand. And this whole thing was starting to crumble. But what I discovered next made me realize that everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and my life had been built on lies. And that was just the beginning. The systematic destruction of my life began 3 days after the threatening text. First, it was Carol Pemberton from the country club calling to check on me with a kind of sugary concern that barely masked gossip hunger. "Ruth, honey, I heard about the incident at Malcolm's wedding. People are saying you seemed a bit unwell." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. "Unwell? Carol, I was escorted out of my own son's wedding by security guards. I think anyone would seem upset." "Oh, of course, dear. But Soraya mentioned to several people that you've been under tremendous strain lately, making some unusual decisions. She's worried about you." Soraya mentioned. The poison was already spreading. By the end of the week, the calls stopped coming entirely. My Thursday bridge club canceled our usual game, something about Nancy's kitchen renovation that would apparently take months. The ladies' auxiliary committee meeting I'd organized for 15 years was mysteriously rescheduled without anyone bothering to inform me. I found out when I showed up to St. Mark's Fellowship Hall and found the doors locked, a hastily scrawled note taped to the glass. "Meeting moved to private residence, committee members notified."
I stood there for 20 minutes in my good dress and sensible shoes, keys dangling from my arthritic fingers before Mrs. Henderson from the Flower Guild walked by and pretended not to see me. The financial attacks started the following Monday. Mrs. Calder, this is Jennifer from First National. I'm calling about some irregularities we've noticed on your business account. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. What kind of irregularities? Well, it appears there may be some discrepancies in your bookkeeping. We've received some concerns about potential financial improprieties at Calder Construction. The words hit me like physical blows. Financial improprieties? In 30 years of running that business, I'd never had so much as a late payment on a vendor invoice. Concerns from whom? I'm not at liberty to say, but we'll need you to come in and provide additional documentation for several of your recent transactions. Until this is resolved, we're going to have to freeze your business accounts. I sank into my kitchen chair, staring at the stack of bills on my table. Payroll for 12 employees, equipment lease payments, insurance premiums. Everything that kept Calder Construction alive was tied to those accounts. How long will this take? Hard to say, ma'am. These investigations can be thorough. The next call came an hour later. The Brennan Foundation, where I'd served on the board for 8 years, where we'd funded scholarships for construction trade students from low-income families. Ruth, this is Margaret. I'm afraid we're going to have to ask for your resignation from the board. No preamble, no explanation, just a polite execution. Margaret! What on earth? We've received some concerning information about your business practices. Until you get your personal affairs sorted out, we feel it's best if you step down. I'm sure you understand. I understood perfectly. The web was tightening, and every strand led back to Soraya Venet Calder. By Wednesday, my cousin Linda called. Linda, who'd stood beside me at Eldrick's funeral. Linda, who'd helped me navigate those first terrifying months of running a construction company while grieving. Linda, who'd been my closest friend since childhood. Ruth, I think we need to talk. Her voice had that careful, therapeutic tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news they think you won't handle well. I've been talking to Malcolm, and honey, I'm worried about you. Really worried. Linda, he says you've been acting erratic, paranoid, making wild accusations about his wife and her family, showing up at his apartment, harassing his lawyer. She paused, and I could hear the judgment in her silence. He says you sent him some kind of rambling letter about conspiracy theories. Rambling letter? I'd written Malcolm a careful, detailed explanation of my concerns about the estate documents. 3 pages of specific questions about dates, signatures, and Julius Venet Calder's involvement. I'd proofread it twice. That wasn't rambling, Linda. I found irregularities in... Ruth, listen to yourself. You sound exactly like Aunt Meredith did before we had to put her in the memory care facility. Aunt Meredith, who died alone and confused, convinced the nurses were stealing her jewelry, insisting that her own children were plotting against her. I'm not losing my mind, I whispered. Honey, that's exactly what she said too. After Linda hung up, I sat in my empty house and felt the silence press against me like a living thing. The grandfather clock Eldrick had bought for our 10th anniversary ticked steadily, marking time I seemed to be losing without understanding how. I tried calling Malcolm, straight to voicemail. I tried calling my lawyer, the one I'd hired to replace Clement. His secretary informed me that they'd be returning my retainer. Something about a conflict of interest that had recently come to light. By Thursday, the tax notice arrived. An official envelope from the IRS demanding immediate payment of $47,000 in back taxes and penalties for unreported income from 2019. Income I'd never received, from sources I'd never heard of, tied to business dealings I'd never made. The letter was coldly professional, but the message was clear. Pay immediately or face asset seizure. I spread the documents across my kitchen table and tried to make sense of the numbers, but the figures swam before my eyes. My blood pressure medication sat beside my reading glasses, both reminders of a body that was failing me when I needed strength most. The phone rang, and for a moment my heart leapt. Maybe Malcolm had come to his senses. Maybe someone believed me. Maybe this nightmare was ending. Instead, it was a woman from the county assessor's office.
Mrs. Calder, we need to discuss some discrepancies regarding your property tax payments. Of course they did. That night, I poured myself 4 fingers of Eldrick's whiskey and sat in his old recliner, staring at the wall of photographs that chronicled our life together. Our wedding day, Malcolm's first steps, Little League games and school plays and birthday parties in this very living room. In every photo, I looked happy, confident, like a woman who knew her place in the world, who understood the rules of the game she was playing. Now I felt like a stranger in my own life. I pulled out the manila envelope from Eldrick Files again, squinting at the legal language by lamplight. Most of it was standard estate planning, wills, trusts, business succession documents. But buried in the middle was something I'd missed before. A property deed transfer, dated just weeks before Eldrick's death. The Meridian Estate, the mansion where Malcolm had gotten married, where I'd been humiliated in front of 200 guests. According to this document, Eldrick had transferred ownership of that property to a trust with 3 beneficiaries: Malcolm, me, and someone listed only as J. Vanette Consulting Partner. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the papers. The mansion wasn't just the venue for my public humiliation. It was supposed to be mine, partly mine, at least. Eldrick had left it to me in some kind of joint ownership arrangement, and somehow Julius Vanette's name was written right into the legal framework. But if that was true, how was Soraya living there? How had she been able to host her wedding there like she owned it? I fumbled for my laptop, my arthritic fingers clumsy on the keys as I searched for property records. The screen glowed in the darkness of my living room, casting harsh shadows on walls that suddenly felt like they were closing in. The current deed showed the property owned by Meridian Holdings, LLC, a company I'd never heard of. But when I dug deeper into the corporate filings, one name appeared again and again as the registered agent: Julius Vanette. I sat back in Eldrick's chair, my chest tight with something between panic and rage. They hadn't just stolen my son. They hadn't just destroyed my reputation, my business, my friendships. They'd stolen my inheritance. The walls were closing in, and the mansion was at the center of it all. I spent the next 3 days like a woman possessed, tearing apart every box, every file cabinet, every forgotten corner of my house where Eldrick might have hidden something, anything that could explain the property transfer I'd found. On Sunday morning, wedged behind the water heater in our basement, I found it.
A metal lockbox I'd never seen before, secured with a combination lock. The numbers came to me like muscle memory. 0417. Malcolm's birthday. Inside were documents that made my pulse hammer against my temples. Eldrick's original will. Not a copy, the original, with the raised seal and witness signatures still sharp and clear. And there it was, in black and white. I, Eldrick James Calder, being of sound mind and body, do hereby name my wife, Ruth Ann Marie Calder, as sole executor of my estate and primary beneficiary of all real property holdings, including but not limited to the estate commonly known as Meridian Manor. My hands trembled as I photographed every page with my phone. Sole executor, primary beneficiary. The legal language was crystal clear. I owned that mansion, or at least the majority stake in it. But there was more. A letter, written in Eldrick's careful handwriting, dated just days before his death. Ruth, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong with our estate planning. Julius Vennet approached me about a partnership opportunity regarding the Meridian property. I was sick, confused by the medications, and I may have signed papers I shouldn't have. This will is the real one. The lockbox combination is Malcolm's birthday. Trust no one else with this. E. The bastard had known. Even dying, even drugged with morphine and fear, Eldrick had sensed the trap closing around us. By Monday morning, I had a plan. I drove to the courthouse in my best black suit, the one I had worn to business meetings when contractors tried to lowball me because I was a woman. My hands were steady for the first time in weeks as I filed a formal challenge to whatever fraudulent will was on record. Then I drove straight to Meridian Manor. The estate looked different in daylight, less imposing, but more real. I could see the craftsmanship Eldrick had poured into every detail, the handcrafted stonework, the custom millwork around the windows, the attention to drainage and foundation work that would keep this place standing for centuries. My husband had built this house, and now I was going to take it back. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell like I belonged there, because legally, I did. Soraya answered, still in her silk robe at 11 in the morning. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely surprised. Ruth Ann, what are you doing here? I held up my phone, the photos of the will visible on the screen. I'm here to discuss my property. Something flickered in her pale green eyes. Not fear exactly, but calculation. Your property? The real will, Soraya, the one your father hoped I'd never find. I stepped past her into the foyer, my sensible shoes clicking against the marble Eldrick had imported from Italy. Lovely renovations you've done. I especially like what you've done with my kitchen. She recovered quickly. I had to give her that. I think you're confused. This house belongs to the estate trust. Malcolm can explain the legal details.
Malcolm doesn't know about this will, does he? I pulled out the printed copies I'd made. Because if he did, he'd realize his new wife has been living in his mother's house, throwing parties with his mother's money, all while convincing him that his mother is crazy. For just a moment, Soraya's composure cracked. I saw something raw underneath. Not guilt, but frustrated rage at being caught. You need to leave, she said quietly. Actually, you need to leave. This is my house now. I called the sheriff's department from the front hallway, using the landline like I owned the place. Yes, I need to report a trespassing situation at my property. People are refusing to vacate after being asked to leave. 20 minutes later, Deputy Morrison arrived with paperwork and a non-nonsense attitude that reminded me of the county inspectors I'd dealt with for 30 years. Soraya had dressed and applied makeup by then, but I could see the strain around her eyes.
Ma'am, you called for trespassers? I handed him the will and the property documents. This is my house, legally inherited from my deceased husband. These people have been living here without permission. Morrison studied the papers with the careful attention of a man who'd seen every kind of family dispute imaginable. This appears to be in order. Ma'am, he addressed Soraya, do you have documentation proving your right to occupy this property? There's been a mistake. This woman is experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. Her son can verify. Ma'am, I need to see legal documentation, not family drama. The door opened and Malcolm burst in, still wearing his work clothes. Someone had called him, probably Soraya, when she'd gone upstairs to dress. Mom, what the hell are you doing? Reclaiming my inheritance, I said simply. I watched his face as Deputy Morrison explained the situation. Confusion first, then something that might have been recognition, then a hardness that settled over his features like a mask. There has to be some mistake. The will was already probated. The estate was settled years ago. Show me. And that's when everything went wrong. 3 hours later, I sat in Judge Martindale's chambers with my hastily hired lawyer, the only one in town who'd take my case, watching my moment of triumph dissolve into ash. Your Honor, the opposing counsel said, Mrs. Calder's document is clearly fraudulent. Note the discrepancies in the witness signatures, the suspicious condition of paper that should be 15 years old, the convenient discovery timing. Judge Martindale, a man I'd known peripherally through various community functions, examined both wills with a magnifying glass. Mr. Peterson, your client's will does appear to have some irregularities. My lawyer, fresh out of law school and clearly over his head, stammered through objections that sounded weak even to my ears. Furthermore, opposing counsel continued, producing a thick folder, we have documented evidence of Mrs. Calder's recent erratic behavior, her harassment of family members, her financial improprieties. Those are lies, I said, but my voice sounded thin, desperate. Mrs. Calder, Judge Martindale said gently, I'm going to order a competency evaluation before we proceed with any property disputes. The words hit me like cold water. Competency evaluation. The legal system's polite way of saying I was crazy. I looked across the courtroom at Malcolm, sitting beside Soraya and Julius Vennett. My son wouldn't meet my eyes, but Soraya smiled at me, a small, triumphant curve of lips that said everything. They'd been ready for this. Of course they had. The erratic behavior reports, the financial accusations, even my discovery of the will, it had all been orchestrated. They knew I'd find it eventually, and they prepared the perfect trap. I wasn't David facing Goliath. I was a mouse being played with by very clever cats. For a brief moment, walking into that mansion with the sheriff at my side, I thought I had won. I thought justice existed, truth mattered, legal documents meant something. But as I sat in that courtroom, watching my son choose his wife's lies over his mother's truth, I realized I was about to fall harder than ever.
The competency evaluation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. 5 days to prove I wasn't losing my mind while everything around me systematically fell apart. I hired Rebecca Chin, a lawyer from the city who specialized in estate fraud. She cost $300 an hour, money I didn't have, pulled from my rapidly dwindling savings account. But she was the first attorney who'd looked at my case and said the word winnable instead of complicated. The timing bothers me, Rebecca said during our first meeting, her sharp eyes scanning the fraudulent will.
Estate documents don't just appear 15 years after probate. Someone's been planning this for a long time. I liked her immediately. No false sympathy, no gentle suggestions about moving on or accepting reality, just hard questions and legal strategy. We need to build a paper trail. Bank records, property transfers, anything that shows a pattern of deception. This is going to get expensive and ugly before it gets better. She wasn't lying about either part. The bills started piling up immediately. Private investigators to track the property transfers, forensic accountants to examine the estate records, expert witnesses to authenticate documents. Every invoice felt like another shovel of dirt on my financial grave. But worse than the money was what Soraya did next. It started with Dr. Patterson's receptionist calling to confirm some information about my recent visits, then my pharmacist asking unusual questions about my blood pressure medication, then Rebecca calling with barely controlled fury in her voice. "Ruth Ann, I need to ask you about your medical history, specifically your mental health treatment from 2018. I felt my stomach drop. "What about it?" "Someone has been sharing details about your therapy sessions after Eldrick's funeral. Details about anxiety medication, grief counseling, a brief hospitalization for what the records describe as acute stress reaction." The hospitalization. 3 days at Mercy General, after I'd collapsed at the construction site, 6 months after Eldrick's funeral. I'd been working 18-hour days, barely eating, pushing my body past its limits while trying to keep the business alive. Dr. Patterson had called it exhaustion and dehydration, but the intake forms had mentioned depression screening, anxiety assessment, standard protocol that now looked damning on paper. How did they get those records? That's what we're going to find out. But Rusanne, this changes things. They're painting a picture of someone with a history of mental instability, someone who might fabricate documents or make false accusations under stress. That afternoon, I found out exactly how they were using the information. Carol Pemberton cornered me at the grocery store, her voice dripping with false concern. "Ruth, dear, I had coffee with Soraya yesterday. She's so worried about you. She mentioned you'd been struggling with emotional issues since Eldrick passed." The way she said emotional issues, like the words themselves were contagious, made my skin crawl. "She thinks maybe the stress of the legal situation is too much for you. Maybe it would be better if you took some time to focus on your health instead of these accusations." I wanted to grab Carol by her perfectly styled shoulders and shake her. Instead, I managed a tight smile and walked away, leaving my half-filled cart behind. But the damage was spreading faster than I could contain it. My doctor's office called to schedule a check-in appointment. The manager at Calder Construction mentioned that several clients had concerns about my ability to handle their projects. Even my mail carrier, Mrs. Rodriguez, started giving me pitying looks when she handed me the daily pile of legal documents and medical bills. The whisper campaign was working. In a town this size, reputation was everything, and mine was being systematically destroyed by someone who understood exactly how to weaponize small-town gossip.
The worst part was the isolation. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Even the checkout girl at the hardware store, where I'd been shopping for 30 years, acted like I might start screaming at any moment. I was becoming the crazy lady, the unstable widow who couldn't accept reality. By Thursday night, I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of wine I couldn't afford and Rebecca's latest invoice, $4,800 for 2 weeks of work, wondering if I should just give up. My blood pressure was spiking daily. I'd lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks.
The constant stress had triggered an eczema outbreak that made my hands look like I'd been clawing at something. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality. That's when I found myself back in Eldrick's study, desperate for something, anything that could prove I wasn't imagining this conspiracy. I'd been through his files dozens of times, but grief and desperation make you miss things. This time, I pulled out every drawer completely, looking for papers that might have slipped behind or underneath. In the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, taped to the underside, where no casual search would find it, was a manila envelope marked insurance, personal. Inside were photocopies of every document Julius Vennet had ever asked Eldrick to sign, every single one, with Eldrick's handwritten notes in the margins. JV says this is temporary, supposed to revert after construction complete. Why does he need power of attorney? My hands shook as I read through them. Property transfers that were supposed to be construction loans, trust documents that gave Julius Vennet temporary control over assets, even a power of attorney that allowed Julius to make legal decisions on Eldrick's behalf during medical treatment. But the most damning document was a letter written in Eldrick's shaky handwriting during his final weeks. Julius Vennet has been pressuring me to sign additional documents. He claims they're necessary for tax purposes, but I've become suspicious of his motives. Ruth doesn't know about these arrangements. She's dealing with enough grief and stress. If something happens to me, she needs to know that Julius has been positioning himself to control our assets through legal manipulation. The original will in the lockbox is the only valid document. Everything else was signed under duress or deception. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have protected her better. Eldrick. I sat there in the lamplight, holding proof that my dying husband had known exactly what was happening, but had been too sick, too drugged, too frightened to stop it. They had not just stolen my inheritance. They'd preyed on a dying man's confusion and his wife's grief to orchestrate the perfect crime. But even with this evidence, even with Eldrick's own words proving the conspiracy, I knew it might not be enough. They'd spent years building the narrative of my instability. They had lawyers, money, social connections, and a community that was already primed to believe I was the problem. I photographed every page, uploaded them to a secure cloud account, and made copies to hide in 3 different locations. If they could play dirty, so could I. But as I locked the documents in my safety deposit box the next morning, watching the bank teller's eyes linger on my shaking hands and unkempt appearance, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. They weren't done. This level of planning, this systematic destruction of my life, it was all building towards something bigger, something that would eliminate me as a threat permanently. I thought it couldn't get worse than being painted as crazy, broke, and isolated. But I was wrong.
The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I'd found Eldrick's hidden documents. Mrs. Calder, this is Detective Sarah Walsh, Financial Crimes Unit. We need to discuss your late husband's estate. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. What about it? We've been investigating some irregularities in property transfers dating back 15 years, specifically transfers involving Julius Vennet and several deceased individuals. Your husband's name appears on multiple documents that may have been altered. 20 years of dealing with contractors had taught me to recognize the moment when everything shifted in your favor. This was that moment. Detective, I have information you need to see. 2 hours later, Detective Walsh sat in my kitchen examining Eldrick's hidden documents while Rebecca Chen took notes, and I tried to keep my hands from shaking with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Mrs. Calder, what you've uncovered here is evidence of a sophisticated fraud operation. Mr. Vennet appears to have been targeting dying property owners for years, using medical crisis as an opportunity to alter wills and transfer assets. She held up one of Eldrick's photocopied documents.
Your husband wasn't the only victim. We've found similar patterns with at least 6 other estates over the past decade. Can you prove it? With these documents and our ongoing investigation, yes. But we'll need you to help us expose the current fraud. Are you prepared for that? I looked at Rebecca, who nodded grimly. It means confronting them directly, with backup. By Thursday afternoon, we were ready. I walked up to the front door of Meridian Manor, my manor, with Detective Walsh, Deputy Morrison, Rebecca Chen, and a court order that made my knees weak with relief. In my purse was a folder containing every piece of evidence we'd assembled: Eldrick's hidden documents, the original will, financial records showing the systematic looting of his estate, and Detective Walsh's preliminary findings on Julius Vennett's pattern of elder fraud. I rang the doorbell like I was announcing the second coming. Soraya answered in yoga pants and a designer sweatshirt, her perfect hair in a messy bun that probably took her 20 minutes to arrange. When she saw the group behind me, something flickered across her face, not fear, but the rapid calculation of someone trying to figure out which lie to deploy. Ruth Ann, this is unexpected. Soraya, I held up the court order. We're here to execute a property seizure warrant. This house is being held as evidence in a fraud investigation. For the first time since I'd known her, Soraya's composure cracked completely. Her face went white, then red, then white again. A fraud investigation? Detective Walsh stepped forward. Ma'am, we're going to need you to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately. You can't be serious. But Soraya's voice had gone thin, high-pitched. This house belongs to my husband's family trust. Malcolm inherited it from his father. Actually, Rebecca said, consulting her paperwork with obvious satisfaction, this property was fraudulently transferred from the estate of Eldrick Calder through forged documents and elder abuse. Mrs. Ruth Ann Calder is the rightful owner. I watched Soraya's face cycle through emotions like a broken slot machine. Denial, rage, fear, calculation. Then something I'd never seen from her before. Desperation. Malcolm! She screamed toward the interior of the house. Malcolm, get down here now! Heavy footsteps on the marble staircase, and then my son appeared, looking confused and annoyed. He was still wearing pajama pants at 2 p.m, which told me more about how comfortable he'd become in the stolen luxury than I cared to know.
What's going on? Then he saw me, and his expression hardened. Mom, what are you doing here? Taking back my house, I said simply. Detective Walsh explained the situation while Malcolm's face went through the same emotional spectrum as his wife's. But when she finished, he looked directly at me with something that might have been the first honest expression I'd seen from him in months. Is this real? The fraud investigation? It's real, I said. Your father knew what Julius was doing, Malcolm. He left me evidence. He was trying to protect us both. That's impossible. Dad trusted Julius. Julius helped us through Dad's illness. Julius helped himself to your father's assets while your father was dying. I pulled out Eldrick's handwritten letter and held it where Malcolm could see it. Your father wrote this during his last week. He knew what was happening, and he was terrified. Malcolm took the letter with hands that trembled slightly. As he read, I watched 30 years of my life with him play across his features. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee I bandaged, every proud moment we'd shared. When he finished reading, he looked at Soraya with an expression I recognized from his childhood, the look he'd get when he realized he'd been lied to about something important. You knew, he said quietly. Malcolm, she's manipulating you again. Can't you see that? But something had shifted in the room's dynamic.
Malcolm wasn't looking at me like I was crazy anymore. He was looking at his wife like she was a stranger. "You knew," he repeated louder this time. "When you told me she was paranoid, when you said she was making up conspiracy theories, you knew she was right. I was protecting you." "From what? From my mother?" And that's when Soraya made the mistake that destroyed everything. "From poverty," she screamed, her perfect composure finally shattering completely. "From ending up in some tiny house, working construction jobs, living like—" She gestured at me with undisguised contempt, like her. The silence that followed was deafening. Malcolm stared at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. "Like her? You mean like the woman who raised me alone, who built a successful business, who sacrificed everything for my future? Malcolm, you don't understand. My father offered us opportunities." "Your father is a criminal," Detective Walsh interrupted. "We have evidence of systematic fraud targeting elderly property owners across 3 counties. Soraya's face crumbled, and suddenly she wasn't the poised socialite anymore. She was just a woman who'd been caught in a lie too big to explain away. "Please," she whispered, grabbing Malcolm's arm. "Please don't let them destroy our life. We can work this out. The house, the money, we can share it with her. We can make this right." But Malcolm was already stepping away from her, his face a mask of disgust and betrayal. "Make it right, Soraya? You helped steal my mother's inheritance. You convinced me she was crazy while you were living in her house, spending her money, planning our wedding in rooms that belonged to her."
"I did it for us. You did it for you." His voice was cold, final, just like everything else. That's when the final twist revealed itself. Soraya suddenly straightened, her tears stopping as abruptly as they'd started. "You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I forged the will. Yes, I manipulated the estate documents. But it wasn't my idea." She pointed a shaking finger at Malcolm. "It was his." The words hit like a physical blow. Malcolm went white. "What? You think I planned this alone? You came to me 3 years ago crying about how your mother was controlling your life, how you'd never be free while she held the purse strings. You're the one who suggested we find a way to neutralize her influence. That's not... I never said..." "She'll never let me live my own life," Soraya quoted, her voice taking on a cruel mimicry of Malcolm's tone. "Sometimes I wish she'd just disappear." "Your words, Malcolm. Your idea. I just made it happen." The betrayal was complete now. Not just Soraya's betrayal of me or Malcolm's betrayal of his mother, but their mutual betrayal of each other. They'd conspired together, and now they were turning on each other like rabid animals. I watched my son realize that his wife had recorded his moment of weakness, his angry words spoken in frustration, and turned them into justification for a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed his relationship with his mother. And I watched Soraya realize that she just confessed to multiple felonies in front of a police detective while trying to blame her husband. Detective Walsh was taking notes. Rebecca Chen was smiling. Deputy Morrison was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Ma'am," Detective Walsh said to Soraya, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Soraya looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over. My father has connections. We'll fight this." "Your father is being arrested as we speak," Detective Walsh replied, matter-of-factly, "along with the lawyer who helped forge the documents and the notary who falsified the witness signatures." And just like that, it was over. The house fell silent except for the sound of Malcolm crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that reminded me of the little boy he'd been when his father died.
Deputy Morrison read Soraya's her rights while she maintained a stony silence. Detective Walsh sealed evidence bags. Rebecca Chen updated her case notes. And I stood in the foyer of my own house, my house, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Vindicated.
6 months later, I woke up in the master bedroom of Meridian Manor, in the bed Eldrick had custom built for the house we'd planned to grow old in together. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows he'd positioned to catch the morning light, and for a moment, just a moment, I could pretend the past year had been a nightmare. Then I remembered that I was sleeping alone in a house too big for one person, and the victory tasted like ashes. The legal aftermath had been swift and brutal. Soraya was sentenced to 4 years for fraud and elder abuse. Julius Vinette got 8 years and full restitution orders that would keep him broke until he died. The lawyer and notary who had helped forge the documents lost their licenses and faced their own criminal charges. The newspaper ran the story on the front page. Local woman exposes multi-million-dollar elder fraud ring. Suddenly, everyone remembered how much they'd always liked me, how they'd never really believed those rumors about my mental state, how obvious it was that something hadn't been right about that Vinette family. Carol Pemberton called to invite me back to Bridge Club. The ladies' auxiliary sent flowers and an apology card. Even my cousin Linda showed up with a casserole and sheepish explanations about how she'd been manipulated by that awful woman. I accepted their apologies with the grace expected of a victim, but something had broken in me that couldn't be repaired by social redemption. I'd learned who my friends really were when it mattered, and the list was shorter than I'd imagined. The mansion came with its own isolation. Every room echoed with memories of the life Eldrick and I had planned but never lived. His workshop in the basement, still filled with half-finished projects, the library where he'd intended to read in retirement, the guest rooms we'd hoped to fill with grandchildren. Grandchildren I probably never have now. Malcolm hadn't spoken to me since the day of Soraya's arrest. I tried calling, texting, even showing up at his apartment, but he'd moved without leaving a forwarding address. Rebecca Chen's investigators found him eventually. He'd relocated to Portland, changed jobs, started over completely. The private investigators' report included photos. Malcolm leaving a coffee shop, Malcolm walking a dog I'd never seen, Malcolm with his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. He looked older, quieter, diminished somehow, but he also looked free in a way I hadn't seen since before he'd met Soraya. Last month he sent me a letter, 1 page, handwritten on plain paper. I know you were right about everything. I know Soraya used me, manipulated me, turned me against you. I know you did what you had to do to expose the truth, but I can't forgive myself for what I put you through, and I can't forgive you for letting me see who I really was. Maybe that makes me a coward, but it's the truth. Don't contact me again. I read it 3 times, then walked to the fireplace in Eldrick's study and watched it burn. Some relationships don't survive the truth, even when the truth sets you free. The house felt different now that it was legally mine. I had had it redecorated, removing every trace of Soraya's influence, but I couldn't erase the memories of that awful wedding day, the humiliation I'd felt walking through these same rooms as an unwanted guest in my own home. I'd won everything and lost the only thing that mattered. Dr. Patterson said it would take time to process the trauma, that victory could be as difficult to navigate as defeat. He prescribed mild anti-anxiety medication and suggested I consider grief counseling, not just for Eldrick, but for the son I'd lost to his own shame and stubbornness.
Some evenings, I sat in the garden Eldrick designed, watching the sun set over the lake, and wondered if I'd made the right choices. Not about exposing the fraud, that had been necessary, inevitable, but about the way I'd fought back, the public nature of Malcolm's humiliation, the complete destruction of the life he'd built on stolen foundations. I could have handled it quietly, maybe, found a way to reclaim what was mine without putting my son's crimes on display for the entire town to see. Maybe there had been a path that preserved both justice and family. But then I remembered Soraya's face when she told me to stay gone, the casual cruelty with which she destroyed my reputation, the systematic way they'd isolated me and painted me as unstable. They'd shown no mercy when they held all the power. Why should I have been merciful when the tables turned? The hardest part was the silence. Not just from Malcolm, but from the life I'd imagined we'd build together. I'd spent 30 years working toward a future where my son would take over the business, where we'd spend holidays together, where I'd spoil grandchildren and tell them stories about their grandfather. Instead, I rattled around in a mansion filled with expensive furniture and bitter memories. Wealthy in everything except the relationships that make wealth meaningful. Mrs. Chen still waved when she saw me in the garden. Rebecca Chen still called to check in on me and update me on various legal proceedings. Detective Walls should even ask me to consult on similar cases involving elder fraud. I had purpose, resources, vindication. I had justice. But justice, I'd learned, was a cold companion on long winter nights. Last week, I started volunteering at the senior center, helping other elderly people navigate complex legal documents and financial decisions. Maybe my experience could prevent someone else from going through what I endured. Maybe that was enough of a legacy. I kept Eldrick's picture on the mantle in the living room, and sometimes I talked to him about the choices I'd made, the prices I'd paid, the justice I'd won at the cost of everything else I'd valued. Was it worth it? I asked his photograph this morning. He didn't answer, of course, but I thought I knew what he'd say. You did what you had to do, Ruth. You fought for what was right. The rest we'll have to live with. Or in my case, live with alone. So tell me, if someone had stolen your life's work, destroyed your reputation, turned your only child against you, and painted you as crazy while they lived in luxury bought with your money, what would you have done? Would you have fought back, knowing it might cost you the only relationship that truly mattered? Or would you have chosen peace over justice, family over truth? If it were you, would you have done differently?